And I want again to thank the program committee for being open to my suggestion of inviting Dr. Jenkins to speak with us. Before I do introduce her, I want to thank some people who've made today possible or have helped promote her visit to Kingsport. She's from Columbia, South Carolina. First of all, the Friends of the Library who have extended the initial invitation, has paid for her travel here from Columbia. Zane and Pat are board members, and Phil are board members of the Friends, as well as I'm a member of the board. To Jeff Hall at the Dobbins-Bennett radio station for having an interview to promote this. Dave Light, yesterday morning we started the day off with Dave at Food City and had a great time. And those of you that are subscribers to the Kingsport Times News hopefully read that long, nice article that was in the Weekender this past weekend. Last night at the Friends of the Library annual meeting, I chastised anybody that was sitting in the audience that was not a subscriber to the local newspaper, and so I'm going to chastise you. If you do not subscribe to your local newspaper, shame on you. They are a great supporter of things that we do here in this club and Friends of the Library, and local government ultimately runs amok when there are no local newspapers to keep it in check. So just keep that in mind when you say, well, it's just a little teeny tiny paper. It's teeny tiny because people don't subscribe to it. Enough preaching here. So Cynthia, Carolyn's friend from Columbia, who has been invaluable in helping sell books, and she will have books for sale. We didn't set up the table, but if you want books, see her after the program. So I know that David Oakes has written 2 books. Has anybody else in here written books besides David and Carolyn? Okay. I know that Katie has illustrated a bunch of books, has done coloring books, activity books. Anybody else? Okay. So we have an author with us today, and she's going to talk about why she wrote this book and the content of this book. Carolyn comes to us after a 38-year experience as an educator across South Carolina, a little bit in Tennessee, and maybe in North Carolina? Yeah. She started out, she grew up in South Carolina, went to Claflin University, got her BA in English, which is in Orangeburg, South Carolina. Then she got her master's in library science from NC Central University in Durham when her husband Clark was at Duke University getting his master's of divinity. And then, Jim, you're going to love this, she got her PhD from the University of South Carolina in education and did her dissertation on Septima Poinsett Clark. And that was part of the reason that she wrote this book, not the only reason.
Go Gamecocks.
But go Gamecocks, that's right. So she lived in Kingsport from 2008 to 2010. Her husband was here from 2007 to 2010, but she had another year in Hilton Head, South Carolina, where they came from before they came to Kingsport to finish out her teaching career. And I mean, it's hard life, living in Hilton Head, but it's a hard drive to come home or come see her husband periodically throughout that year from Hilton Head.
Just to hear him preach.
Just to hear him preach. And he was noted for his 7-minute sermons. 7 minutes. I'm telling you, it's awesome. 7-minute sermons. Anyway, last spring, I found out that she had written this book, and it kind of started me on a quest to bring her back to Kingsport so that we could learn about this book and to love on her. And so the ultimate love was last night at the Friends of the Library annual meeting that Mayor Paul Montgomery gave her a city commendation, which I just thought was awesome. So anyway, Carolyn, come and talk to us about Septima Poinsett Clark and why you wrote this book. So let's give her a Kiwanis welcome.
morning, a little bit afternoon. It is my pleasure to be here with you today. I want to say thank you to all of you for your presence, and I certainly want to thank Gail for having me to be introduced to you today, and of course, Donna, I appreciate the invitation. My former neighbor, David, invited me to visit, do you remember, with you guys in 2008. And our stay here was very short, but I finally made it, okay? Okay, I had to write the book first, but anyway. But thank you all for being here. So yes, do we have the little clicker right here, okay? Yes, I'm celebrating a year of having written this book, Blazing Toward Freedom. And so I do want to tell you a little bit about the research and about the book and how it's laid out. And I think that this subject, Mrs. Septima Poinsett Clark, is a good person, a wonderful person for everybody to know about, but you do so much of service, so many different services to the community, and particularly to children. And so I congratulate you on the work that you do. And but this lady also was a servant leader. Now, let me go back one. Yes. So here's Mrs. Clark, and I received a phone call from her, and that phone call changed my life. And I'm going to tell you what the conversation was. And those of you who heard me speak yesterday, you heard this story already. But Mrs. Clark called me one Sunday morning because my husband, who, former pastor at First Broad Street, was passing downtown Charleston. And she called, I answered the phone, and we were having really an early dinner. And I said, hello, and she said, hello, Mrs. Jenkins, I really enjoyed that play you produced this morning. And as I said to the group yesterday, I know this was not First Broad Street's approach to treating wives of ministers, your minister's wife, to give. And some churches will have the minister's wife do everything nobody else would do, right? And so I was doing the play. But anyway, I was delighted that somebody would even think of the play such that they will call and say congratulations. And so when I hung up, my husband said, who was that? And I said, and I used the month, September Clark. And of course, his name was Clark, no relation. And he said, September. He said, oh, no. He said, that was somebody. And of course, her name is Septima Poinsett Clark. And I didn't know who she was. But then I discovered that she was a major civil rights icon. And so I wanted to know more about who she was. How could this person be so important, so special, and having done so much that I didn't know about her? And I was an educator, I'm a teacher, I'm a librarian, and my children would come to the library to research topics, weekly, but in the month of February, there was always a search for African American person that they would look up. But anyway, I wanted to make sure that more people, other than great people like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, be looked up. And so anyway, this lady, as I found out, and I did a dissertation on her, okay? But I found out her father was born into slavery on a plantation in Georgetown, South Carolina. And so even though I knew her story after I finished the dissertation, I needed to connect his story to her story because I was able to get all of this information. It's all nonfiction. And I don't think our children know their history like they should know. And so I became passionate about telling not only her story, but wanting to make sure our children get the history. And this is all of our history. This is American history. And so I had to trace her father's life. And I traced him to plantation in Georgetown. And in the book, I take the reader to the plantation, and I go through his life as a slave and what he did as a slave. And then I trace his life all the way through Civil War, which he fought in the war, and into emancipation, and then of course Reconstruction, but I pick up her life later and take her life through the Civil Rights Movement, which is really how the book is laid out. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, and so, but her major contribution, let me tell you what her major contribution was, and she did a lot of things. And as a matter of fact, one of my professors at the University of South Carolina, because I was working on her part of the story, he said that she had many dimensions, and I came to see that was true because of all these things that she eventually did, and you'll find this out in the book. But her major contribution, in my opinion, was that she created a curriculum that trained over 100,000 African Americans how to pass the Jim Crow literacy tests in the 50s and become registered voters. And this is throughout the South. Isn't it amazing? Okay, so this is just one piece of her life, okay? And so that's one thing that I think was her major contribution, and she was indeed an advocate for civil rights, voting rights, for human rights. Okay, so I set out to solve a problem, and that was to make Mrs. Clark's life known, and to place her in a canon of recognition that she was really a social justice warrior, okay? And then I also wanted to engage our children and our families in learning African American heroes, places, cultures, and history. And now I want you to know that when I wrote the book, it is still not just Mrs. Clark's father and her life, but it's the people around them, okay? Because you can't have a story is not complete if you're only talking about one facet of life in that time or that time period or on that plantation. Okay? So it's very inclusive. But this is the book, Blazing Toward Freedom, and I am celebrating 1 year of publication, so I'm happy about that. But this is the way the book is broken down. It's broken down into two parts. Part one is the life of Peter, her father, and his mother was brought to America on a slave ship. I have Mrs. Clark to tell her own story. I wrote it first person, and then I went back, I wrote it third person. I wrote the book third person, and it was like, no, it's not quite as personal. And so I used her creatively, and this is a creative portion of it, to tell what happened to her, what happened to her father and all the rest, because her father told a lot about his past, so I was able to use all that. But she also wrote 2 books, okay, so that was helpful. But, so I actually have her sitting in a nursing home on Johns Island. By the way, I lived on Johns Island when she passed in that nursing home. So not only did she call me unexpectedly, and I never spoke to her again, but she and I were neighbors when she had her last life. And so it was really touching, and I also understood that sometimes the person, the biography, the person whose life you're telling picks someone to tell their story. And so we had that kind of connection a couple times throughout. But anyway, her father was born on a plantation called White House Plantation. Has anybody been to Georgetown, South Carolina before? Yes, I see some hands up. And you know, there are a lot of plantations still there. White House is still there. I went to White House Plantation doing my research. And I just want to share with you that, okay, so I had another event in Myrtle Beach, and I thought, well, hey, this is a good time to check out this plantation that I've been studying about and reading about. And so I was just excited in my car, you know, with the little sunroof back. It was a summer day, driving to find this plantation. And as I traveled, suddenly I noticed the road was getting smaller. And then it was almost like, well, it's no longer 2 lanes. And I'm using my GPS, right? GPS gets you to places. And so then not only was it like a one way, but the pavement of the road had become scattered. There was grass, there was some pavement. I'm like, oh my God. And there's all these trees and everything, and my GPS stopped. So I'm sitting there in front of, really, it was like a gate of some sort, and this truck pulls up, this big truck with this big guy in it, a Caucasian man, and he looks at me, he rolls down his window, and he says, may I help you? And I told him what I was doing. It turns out he was the owner of the plantation, and he invited me in, and we rode around in his golf cart, and we looked. He took me over the whole plantation. That was exciting. So I have some pictures I'll share with you. But anyway, I do, as I say, share the life of her father through Civil War, emancipation. You have to find out, what side of the war he fought on. You'll have to find out from the book what happened to him after emancipation. But anyway, the second part of the book is Mrs. Clark's life. She was a teacher. She was a forerunner and advocate for social justice. She actually fought for equal pay for teachers. She had her students do a petition door to door, created a petition that was used to try to have the city of Charleston to allow black teachers to teach in the city of Charleston. So there were only white teachers able to teach our children and no black teachers during that time. So anyway, she was involved with those kinds of efforts. Major contribution I already mentioned to you. And this is a picture of White House Plantation. Look at the blue sky there. And if you see in the background, the brown, those are rice paddies. And so they still have rice paddies that grow up after all these years. And this is, you see better here, rice paddies. And so this young man grew up on this plantation, and it was a rice plantation, and he was a house servant. And I think he called it house native, okay? And his job every day was to carry the books of the 2 young men who lived in the home, and they rode horseback to school every day. And this little boy carried their books, and he walked to school. And actually, I drove the walk, and this is a part of that walk. I'm sure the road is wider now than what it was then, but this is the trail he took to school every day as he walked and carried the books. And when he arrived, he didn't go inside, of course. He stayed on the outside, rain or shine, and with the horses. And it's another sight from the plantation. I just love the trees. Now, Mrs. Clark's first teaching experience was on John's Island. And this is the picture of actually, am I speaking through the mic?
Yeah.
Okay. This is a picture of the one-room schoolhouse and all of the children there. Okay? And so she did a lot to improve their experiences. And I think there were 3 Caucasian children on the island, and they had a different facility and all the rest, and more staff. But these children had 2 teachers, and they went in every morning, and she used cleaner bags to write the lessons on, to hang up on the wall. And also, they would get down on their knees. The benches that they sat on were their desks. And so they would get down on their knees and use the seats for writing. But anyway, all of that was a part of her early teaching career. This is a picture of a place I went to do some of the research. Anybody recognize this building? Well, this is in Montego, Tennessee. This is Highlander. How many of you are familiar with Highlander?
Is that near New Market?
Yes, that's where it is. But this is that exact same building. But she lost her job in South Carolina. The state of South Carolina would not hire her back to do the teaching because they didn't want anybody to be members of the NAACP. And so they did not renew her teaching contract. And she had spent 40 years, and they took her pension and her job. And so she was able to get a job at Highlander in Tennessee, New Market, Tennessee. And there she worked with, let me see, oh, this is just a picture of Highlander. Isn't it beautiful? But you all know what Tennessee looks like, right? And but Miles Horton, the gentleman who's sitting on the table there, he ran this particular place. And it was a place where folk could go to solve problems. The people who were in the labor movement, I think in the 30s, they gathered there and talked about their problems, came up with answers to how to solve their problems, and went back into their communities and implemented the plans. So Miles Horton thought, well, this is a great time to address some of the problems we have with the racial issues in our America. And so he had people from all over coming there talking about, you know, the problems that they have, and then go back into their communities and train people or help people to get those problems solved. So this gentleman he's talking to is named Esau Jenkins. Esau Jenkins came from the low country of South Carolina, went to Highlander with Mrs. Clark, who had, you know, was really the person in charge of that educational program. And so what you had to do after you got the training, you had to decide what kind of problem you were going to go back home and solve for your people. And so he went back and he said he wanted his people to be able to vote. And so he had a bus that he traveled from Johns Island over into downtown Charleston, carrying people to work, okay? So, you know, when Mrs. Clark started teaching on the island, when she started teaching on the island, there were no roads. But now at this time, there were roads. And so this man was a registered voter. But in South Carolina, you know, we had all these particular tests. And each state had its own tests. And the tests that you had to take before they would give you your voter registration card. And in South Carolina, the test included reading a portion of the Constitution. So these were people who had no education, who couldn't read and write, but yet in order to get a voter registration certificate, they were to pass or be able to read this portion of the Constitution. So this gentleman on his bus, this bus right here, he taught the people to memorize the portion of the Constitution. But he asked for help, and Miles Horton gave them funding from the school, and they started classes, okay? So that's the big part of this. And I want you to know this bus now is in it's in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., because this is a historic piece, okay? And so if you go to there, you see it. And this is a store on Johns Island that they disguised it because it was a storefront at the front of it. So everybody who passed through and everything, they just knew it to be a store. But in the back of the store is where they taught people how to read and write and pass these tests. And this is an example of the first class. And so, anyway, so this is a part of Mrs. Clark's work, and I do go into some of this in the book. And this is one of the early teachers, and these were her students. And this lady was a teacher too, and she taught in Mississippi, and her name was Victoria, and she's in the book, and she was one of the 3 people who went to Washington, D.C. As that committee that was to represent a party, the Democratic Party, because you know we could not vote in the Democratic Party back then. And so they organized themselves in Tennessee, but they went to Washington, D.C. to the National Democratic Convention, and they wouldn't let them vote. And that's a major part of history. All this is in the book. And so these are other classes in other states. This is a Georgia class. Mrs. Clark is in the right back corner back there. So they taught people all over. Now this picture is at Highlander. And I want you to know that Rosa Parks is on this picture. Do you see Rosa? Yes. Right over here on the left. Is it? I don't know if this is. Okay. Well, Rosa was in Mrs. Clark's training classes 3 months before she refused to give up her seat on the bus. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, when Mrs. Clark died, I told you I was on the island also at that time, Rosa came to her funeral and she announced to the congregation, you call me the mother of the movement. If I'm the mother of the movement, Seppi, because they called her Seppi, her close friends, Seppi was the grandmother of the movement. And that's what she told the congregation. But, and then you see another gentleman near the far right, the second guy, you recognize? Yeah, that's Martin Luther King. Mm-hmm. Martin Luther King was in her training sessions. And because the state of Tennessee did not like what they were doing at Highlander, they actually burned down the site, the first site. They ended up in like 3 different sites. But they had the fourth before they knew that the city was, not just the city, it was actually the state of Tennessee, the governor, was set on closing them down. You know, it was different, you know. And so they had the foresight to pack up all their books and materials and send them to Madison, Wisconsin for safekeeping at an archives there. But they did burn down the site. And this particular meeting that they were having, they created billboards of Martin Luther King in it. And in this picture, there's also a journalist who was a journalist for a communist paper. And so they took pictures, made big billboards with Martin Luther King in it, not necessarily this particular picture, and that particular journalist, and the billboards said big words, communist training camp. And so this was one of the ways that they helped to help people have a mindset that this was not what you wanted to take place in the state. Okay, so but anyway, Martin Luther King invited Mrs. Clark to bring that program to SCLC, and it traveled across 11 southern states. And I want you to know that she touched, and there she is in her home, sitting there, but if you notice the man on the upper right corner, you recognize him? Thurgood Marshall. Okay, so she was involved with Brown v. the Board of Education because the first case was in South Carolina, but it wasn't named for the South Carolina case. It was like 5 cases. And so when the Supreme Court made that ruling on Brown v. Board of Education, Thurgood Marshall came straight back to South Carolina, and he actually went to Claflin University and had a big response with audiences and all the rest of the celebration. And but Mrs. Clark touched those kinds of lives, okay? And that's the kind of work she did. And she worked with Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, and John Lewis wrote about her in his memoir. And so John Lewis talks about her and what kind of person she was in training. All right, so anyway, this is a picture of Madison, Wisconsin, where I went to do some of the research. And I want you to know, and I'm nearly at the end, she was a servant leader. You guys are servant leaders as you impact the lives of your people in your community and so forth. She was a teacher. She made sacrifices to serve. She sacrificed her teaching career. They did give her back later on the money that she had put into her pension in South Carolina. I guess we were embarrassed that we did her that way eventually, because, you know, but she became so well known and did so much, and even the highest of people, the president of the United States and all the rest, did recognitions of sorts for her. But they did give her that back, but they didn't give her the compounded interest as such, so she never got it all back. Okay, and then she did fight for equal pay, so she made these kinds of sacrifices, and so forth. And leadership, this was the leadership schools that she created. There are citizenship schools, leadership schools. She trained the teachers. She trained teachers who trained teachers who trained teachers. And all of these teachers who were trained went back into their communities, and then they trained folk in their kitchens and their churches, and so forth. And this is how the numbers of 100,000, they kept up with the numbers, were registered as a result of this training. And of course, like I said, it went across 11 states. So this is really, in summary, blazing toward freedom, subject of points that card stirred from slave to queen mother, the movement. I know that our children don't know all of their history, but I wrote this book so that a 7th grade level and through adult, and this is also coordinated with the curriculum, and South Carolina school curriculum. South Carolina history is in this, but it's also U.S. history. And so I matched it up with their school curriculum. A family memoir that traces a family lineage from slave existence to fighters for civil rights and historical events as a backdrop. So I take their lives, but in the backdrop, there's all this history taking place. And that's how I laid out the book. And the intent was to share more history, American history, with the children and interested adults. It's all our history, American history. That's my story.